following clip has been taken from our 2024 Australian Army Flying Museum video with presenter Scott Downs. Follow the link in the description for the full tour.
The Sopwith Camel. The Sopwith Camel is a development of earlier aircraft, but around about December of 1916, so late 1916, it's first deployed onto the battlefield. It's a difficult aircraft to fly, but once you master the aircraft, it is an unbelievably capable air superiority fighter. Its whole job is to shoot down other fighters. It doesn't have a secondary role. By this time, by about halfway through the Great War, various air forces are working out that there are various jobs that aircraft do well and other things that they do poorly and so forth. The Camel's a great example of that, being a pure fighter. Other aircraft that the AFC were flying at the time are aircraft like the F2B, the Bristol F2B, which was a two-seater fighter, but could also be used for observation and photographic missions and so forth. And that leads me kind of into where aviation came from or what it did in the First World War. As we know, the Great War was a very finite conflict. It was down that trench line which ran effectively from the North Sea to the Swiss border, right through the middle of France. And we have this concept in our heads because of the way we've been taught at school with all the photos and stuff, that the whole of France is obliterated. It's a big mud pie. That's very much not true. It's a very finite conflict. It's only about 15 Ks or maybe even 10 Ks either side of the front line. So it was easy to take photographs and do the reconnaissance in the battle space and find out what was happening just outside the battle space and inside the battle space. So where the enemy are digging trenches, where they're holding their cavalry, where their stores depots are, where they're building railways and so forth and so on. But to study that, we needed photographs. So every day from right at the beginning of August 1914, aircraft were being launched to take photos of what the opposition were doing. And the cameras improved and the aircraft improved, but right through the war, they took photographs. And it is possible, if you go to the Imperial War Museum in London, it is possible to get a photo mosaic map of the entire British sector of every day of the conflict because of the amount of photos they took. Obviously, the enemy wants to stop us taking photos and we want to stop the enemy taking photos. So we would launch fighters to shoot them down, and that's basically where it came from. Now, that is the first and most important role of aviation on any battlefield, is reconnaissance. And we still spend, defence and nations still spend the most money on their reconnaissance aircraft. And often when I get people in here, they'll say, no, they don't. An F-35 fighter's worth, $70 million, and it's not a reconnaissance asset, it's a pure fighter. The reality is the most expensive aircraft we run are satellites, and they only do one job, and that's take photos. So even though they're not in atmosphere, they're still a flying machine, and they take photographs. So it's still the most important and basic role. So when you look at the aircraft behind me, there's a few things to sort of notice about a pure fighter in a First World War fighter. They had to be almost out of control. They were at the edge of controllability, and pure fighters are still that to this day. And to achieve that in the First World War, you'll note the aircraft behind me, and they're all very similar. All the heavy things in the aircraft are in a very small space. So the pilot, the undercarriage, the guns, the fuel, the ammunition, all the very dense, heavy things are in a very small space, almost in a ball shape, around the centre of the aircraft. They've got short wings, it's got a short wingspan, but there are many of them, 2 and in some cases 3 wings, so biplanes, triplanes. They're also very short coupled, so from motive power, the propeller, to the tail, the empennage, the rudder and the elevator, it's a very short space. So when these aircraft launched off the ground, almost from the instant you were airborne, the aircraft was on the edge of controllability. And all the aircraft doing that job were very much like that. And you can see that when it comes together behind you. And probably the last point, you'll note the guns, the 2 guns that fire through the propeller. Now they're synchronised guns. For the first 18 months or so of the war, the Allies had no synchronised guns. And we were trying to find ways of doing that. And in fact, Roland Garros, Roland Garros in France, where the French Open's held, it's named after a man actually called Roland Garros. He was the first French ace, the first French person to shoot down 5 aircraft. He did it with guns shooting through the propeller with deflectors on it too. When the bullets actually hit it, they would deflect them away. But by that point, the Germans had invented or were applying synchronisation, and there was a time called the Fokker Scourge and so forth. It was a really terrible time. We were sort of building 17 aircraft to one, training about 18 pilots to one, the Allies, and we were still losing the air battle to the Fokkers. So there was a whole bunch of stuff. We had to steal the technology, apply the technology. By about 1916, halfway through 17, we are starting to get air superiority, and pretty much the Germans can't get that back with the amount of aircraft they can create and the constraints that their resources apply to them. They can't get that back ever, except locally when they bring, the Flying Circus, Richthofen and his Flying Circus. They would move to a space in the battle, get local air superiority for a period, for 3 weeks or something. Great misconception. People think that the Flying Circus was called the Flying Circus because of all the colours on Richthofen's squadron's aircraft. It wasn't. It was because they were like a circus. They came to town. They were intense, they came here and then they went there. And they would go and they would get local air superiority for a period, maybe it's 3 week or month period, and then they would move on and get air superiority for another attack or to blunt a British or French attack. So it was quite an interesting period. Lastly, everything that we do in the military, pretty much every single thing that we do as military aviators was defined by the end of 1918. So close air support, air superiority, strategic bombing, strategic transport, tactical bombing, tactical transport. Almost every job that we do had been defined by 1918. The only things that are new in the aviation world is in the Second World War in 1940, the Germans applied parachuting, so airborne operations, and it was a great success and was used, as we know, through all Saving Private Ryan and all the rest of it through many parts of the war in the Second World War. And then just after the war, about 1948, the theory of air mobility came to being. And then by about 1960, the aircraft had been developed to create an air mobile element within defence forces around the world. So they're the only two new things. Everything else has been around since, day one pretty much.
For more of this 2024 Australian Army Flying Museum tour with presenter Scott Downs, follow the link in the description.